In 2017, Lifeway removed the narrative by Sho Baraka from their shelves because it contained language that some customers found offensive. As a business, they wanted to honor the desires of their target demographic. But what was the language? Just this. On the album's final song, he said the word penis. Our first heart posture was that God's design for sexuality is fundamentally good, but it's going to be difficult to convey that if we regard even the most scientific words for sexual organs as profanity.
We met an art teacher at a school in Virginia who asked if we ever talked about nudity in our presentations at Access. We told her we talked about porn sometimes, and she said that's part of the problem. The only time the naked body is ever discussed, it's on pornography's terms. She had been trying to incorporate some classical nude art into her curriculum, but for her students who were committed to purity, they couldn't look at the art in good conscience. The paradigm they had been raised with taught that any depiction of the naked human body would always and automatically lead to sexual arousal, and that sexual arousal would always and automatically become the kind of sinful lust that Jesus condemned in the Sermon on the Mount.
That brings us around to our fourth heart posture. But before we go there, remember, all 3 videos are live, so take a moment, spread the word, and share with anyone you think might benefit. Now here's a quick recap of everything we've covered so far. Our first heart posture was that God's design for sex is good. Our second was that we should show Gen Z the why behind the what. And our third was that in a pornified culture, abstinence is agency. Our fourth heart posture is this. Before we are sexual and before we are romantic, we are God's image bearers. This video is all about reinstating that view of our humanity, above the sexually enticing and romantic views.
Part of why breastfeeding is so awkward in some places is because we've accepted a definition of breasts that say they exist primarily or even exclusively for the sexual enticement of others. To try to think of breasts as reservoirs of life, or as part of a whole person, a whole portrait of our Creator, runs deeply against the grains of both secular and Christian society. On both sides, we're indoctrinated by the pornographic and prudish views of the body. And though these two views seem opposite, they're actually mutually reinforcing.
The pornographic view of the body starts with the assumption that the body exists to sexually entice others. And then it works to exploit that through pornography or through using sexuality to sell products. The prudish view of the body fears this enticement, and its solution is that as much of the body as possible should remain covered at all times. Although this view of the body usually comes with a desire for sexual purity, it ends up reinforcing the pornographic view of the body. How? By acting as if seeing too much of the body is what always and automatically leads us into sexual enticement and sin. Ultimately, this does nothing to question the deeper lies that give the pornographic view its power, and it maintains the assumption that our degree of sexual purity will remain determined by what we see as opposed to how we see.
As Pastor David Martin wrote for My Chains Are Gone Ministries, prudery hides the body, calling the Creator's design a lustful indecency. Pornography flaunts it, using prudery's definition to turn the beauty of God's handiwork into a stimulus for impure sexual thoughts. Wherever a wholesome, godly view of the naked human body is rejected and a shameful, obscene view is embraced, the resultant religious zeal of prudery inevitably plunges a society into the hellish depravity of pornography.
Psalm 139:14 says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." What would it take for Gen Z to become a generation that was so in awe and so grateful for the gift of their bodies that their gratitude easily turned back into praise? At present, instead of allowing the beauty of God's image to inspire awe and appreciation, we define God's image as inherently dangerous and most attraction to it as sinful.
And then those definitions often become self-fulfilling. If we assume we've already sinned in our attraction, we lose motivation to abstain from indulging in sexual fantasy or pornography. So we install internet filters and create groups to keep each other accountable. And we shouldn't be careless about this because pornography's slant on the body is never neutral and always encourages objectification. But when all our efforts go toward monitoring what we see, we may completely neglect the deeper issue of how we see.
To some of you, this all may sound insane. It did to us too when we first heard it. But when we look at scripture, Galatians 5:23 lists self-control as a fruit of the Spirit within us, not a fruit of others' modesty. In fact, when we look at the main modesty verse in context, we see that Paul was referring to women not flaunting their wealth in front of others who were poor. I want the women to dress modestly, not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls, or expensive clothes. Not only that, but Colossians 2:23 clearly states that man-made rules lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence.
That said, we now have to recognize that most people see human beings through the pornographic view. To go back to video 2, if a boy asks your daughter for naked pictures, we obviously can't pretend like his motivations are neutral. More than anything, we're talking about cultivating the way your sons and daughters regard others and themselves as made in the image of God.
But the pornographic view of the body is learned early, so it's important to begin having conversations about the goodness of God's design early. As a dad of younger kids, the book Good Pictures, Bad Pictures makes it easy to discuss the harmful potentials of pornography in very age-appropriate ways. One user's 5-star review of this book said, "I personally sought out this book for my 6-year when he tearfully reported seeing naked people on a 6-year-old friend's phone. My son was not able to verbalize what he had seen."
With older kids or teens, some of the best conversations often happen side by side as opposed to face to face. So in the car, at a baseball game, at the campfire. The face-to-face, across-the-table interaction can feel confrontational and awkward, especially if talking about some of these things for the first time. We would encourage you to get into the habit of spending time routinely with your kids, hanging out in their world, figuring out what they love and becoming comfortable there. And as you've continued to build trust, to then gradually begin introducing questions that spark thought and can lead to more open conversations about sexuality.
Today, these conversations are more important than ever. While many members of the transgender community are on a much quieter, individual quest for self-discovery, the louder voices at the extreme end of the spectrum always get the most attention. According to some of these voices, it's now fascist to say that having a penis means you're male, or having a vagina means you're female. And again, if we're not even willing to use these words or talk about these topics, we're resigning the next generation to multiple layers of confusion.
We received an email from a woman who said that growing up, she had been attracted to other girls, but it had never really become a huge part of her life. Then she wrote this: "If I had grown up today, I probably would have considered myself a lesbian." In today's culture, her passing attraction would have been interpreted as a core part of her identity, and she would have been much more likely to start building her sense of self around it.
Today, we're often encouraged to build our whole sense of self around our romantic or sexual attractions. Growing up for many millennials, Disney movies and songs by artists like Taylor Swift contributed to the idea that having a romantic relationship is the only thing that gives life meaning. For Gen Z, although the specific artists and film companies might be changing, a lot of the same assumptions about where we find wholeness are getting translated into a culture that is much more accepting of diverse sexual expressions.
So when a movie like Love, Simon comes out, which is about a very likable, very normal guy who just happens to be gay, trying to find his other half. To many members of Gen Z, it feels unfair that straight people are allowed to look for their other half, while those that experience same-sex attraction aren't allowed to do so. This kind of framing leads more people to support same-sex relationships and marriage because we don't want to deny anyone the pursuit of what we've decided makes us whole. And it makes romance into an idol and gives the impression that it's not possible to live a fulfilled life as a single celibate person.
Which brings us back to our fourth heart posture, that being romantic and sexual are only one small part of our good identity as God's image bearers. When we make romance and sex into idols, the LGBTQ+ conversation becomes impossible. But as Rowan Williams wrote in Being Human, before anything or anyone is in relation with anything or anyone else, it's in relation to God. In video 1, we talked about how sex is a beautiful symbol of our communion with God. But celibate singleness is no less a symbol. In fact, singleness has been called a realized eschatology, a current picture of how things will be in the end. As Jesus said in Matthew 22:30, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So then celibate singleness becomes a picture of being reserved for the wholeness that only our relationship with God can bring.
Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we know that many of you have already been thinking about these ideas. You just need help integrating and applying them into practical conversations. Maybe for some of you, the sex talk is something that you've been dreading ever since your babies were born. We want to help you put words and actions to those fears and help your kid navigate the sexual culture of today. That's why we've not only created this free video series, but an entire Sex Talk 2.0 content suite. Whether you want help discussing God's design for marriage, sexting, lust, LGBTQ+ issues, masculinity, femininity, consent, pornography, abortion, contraception, modesty, masturbation, or all of the above, Sex Talk 2.0 is your one-stop shop. Sexuality is a huge conversation on its own, but of course it's not the only conversation. There are also mental health issues to talk about, conversations about social media, and how to frame topics like these in the context of discipleship. We want you to be fully equipped to tackle whatever comes your way. That means we want you to have everything we've ever made and ever will make. The All Access Pass is our entire collection of resources that we've created to help you talk about anything and everything with your kids, and help them see how faith is relevant to every aspect of their lives. In the past, Sex Talk 2.0 alone was $99, but now we want you to have access to our entire content database for the same price, just $99 a year. With the All Access Pass, you'll also receive our weekly digest and monthly success path to help you work through a theme per month for all 12 months of your membership. We are in your corner, and we want to help you build deep, meaningful, and lifelong faith with your kids.
You'll be able to connect with your family, grow spiritually, and be discipling the next generation to think about sexuality in a healthy and godly way.
And with that, we just want to say thank you for taking the time to watch these 3 videos. We know that it's not always easy to think about all that's at stake when it comes to sexuality and the next generation. But the fact is, we can't be shy about having these conversations. The next generation needs you.